The Great Hall at Westminster was chaos. It was the winter of 1388, and King Richard II was holding court. 1,000 candles fought the gloom, their light glinting off silver plates and jeweled cups. The air was thick with the sounds of minstrels, the shouts of servants, and the low roar of 100 lords and ladies talking at once. I was a boy then, just 14, working in the royal kitchens. My name was Will, and my father was a farmer in Kent. He raised pigs. My job was to carry platters from the kitchen to the hall. The head cook was a man named Guillaume, a Norman whose family had been in England for generations, but still spoke French as if it were the only language God understood. He was a tyrant in the kitchen, a storm of curses and commands. That night, the centerpiece was a whole roasted boar, its skin crackling and its mouth stuffed with an apple. But there were other dishes, dozens of them. Platters of spiced meats, pies shaped like castles, jellies in shimmering colors. Guillaume shouted at one of the undercooks, "Vite, le porc, where's the pie of pork? Pork." The word was sharp, clean. It meant the meat on the plate, the thing you ate with a silver knife. It was a word for the table, for the feast. When I carried a heavy platter of pork pies into the hall, I passed a window. For a moment, the noise faded, and I thought of my father's farm. I thought of the animals I helped him tend. They were not porks, they were swīn. That was the old English word. Swīn was the animal in the mud, the creature that grunted and foraged for acorns in the woods. It was a word for the field, for the work. Swīn was the living thing. Pork was the dead thing. I saw it clearly in that moment. Two worlds separated by a kitchen door. In the fields of Kent, English-speaking men, like my father, raised the swīn. In the halls of Westminster, French-speaking men, like the king, ate the pork. The animal had an English name. But the moment it became food for the rich, it took a French one. It was a gap you could hear. A gap between the man with the dirt under his fingernails and the man with the gravy on his chin. And it wasn't just pigs. And I learned that night that the language of the farm was English, but the language of the menu was Norman French. The two rarely met. Number 10, a deer belonged to a king, not to the man who found it. The year is 1105. The man's name is Cynric. He lives on the edge of the Great Forest, the one King William called the New Forest. It is not new, it has been there forever, but the laws are new. Cynric is an Englishman, a Saxon. He remembers his grandfather's stories of a time before the Normans came. A time when a man could hunt for his family, a time when the forest belonged to the people who lived in it. Not anymore. Cynric's daughter, Edgith, is sick. She has a fever that will not break. The village healer says she needs meat, good red meat, to build her strength. But there is no meat. The harvest was poor. The lord of the manor, a Norman named Sir Renaud de Courcy, took his share of the grain, and the single pig the family owned is part of his due. There is nothing left but roots and thin soup. Cynric has a bow his grandfather made. It is yew, strong, and supple. He keeps it hidden under the thatch of his roof. To own such a bow is dangerous. To use it in the king's forest is a death sentence. Or worse, he has heard stories of poachers caught by the king's foresters, men with their eyes put out. Men with their hands cut off, the forest law is absolute. All the animals within it belong to the king. The word Cynric uses for the animal he seeks is dēor. In the old tongue, his grandfather's tongue, dēor meant any wild beast. A fox was a dēor. A boar was a dēor. But the Normans, with their endless hunts, had made the word mean one thing above all others, the red deer. The king's favorite quarry. That night, Cynric slips into the forest. The moon is a sliver. Every shadow is a forester. Every snap of a twig is the sound of his own capture. He moves with a skill born of desperation. He knows the trails. He knows where the animals come to drink. After hours of waiting silent and still, he sees it. A young buck, not yet full grown, but large enough. His heart pounds in his chest. This is not sport. This is not a game of nobles on horseback with their hounds and horns. This is a father trying to save his child. He draws the bow. The string is tight against his cheek. He lets the arrow fly. It strikes true. The dēor falls. Now the real danger begins. He must butcher the animal quietly. He works with a small, sharp knife. He cannot take the whole carcass. It is too much to carry, and the hide and antlers would be impossible to explain. He cuts away the haunches, the best meat, and wraps them in a cloth sack. He buries the rest, hoping the wild pigs will find it before the foresters do. He makes it home before dawn. His wife, Elfwin, says nothing. She sees the look in his eyes. She takes the sack and hides the meat in the salt barrel. Think they will eat well for a week, maybe two. Edgith will have her broth. She might live. A few days later, Sir Renaud de Courcy rides out for a hunt. He is a large man, red-faced and loud. He speaks only French. He calls the hunt la chasse. He is not hunting for food. The manor kitchens are full. He is hunting because it is his right as a nobleman. It is a performance of his power and his status. His word for the quarry is not dēor. It is venaison. The word comes from the old French verb vener, to hunt. Venaison does not mean a specific animal. It means the flesh of any hunted game. It is the prize at the end of the sport. Sir Renaud and his party ride through the forest with a great clamor. Their hunting horns echo through the trees. Their dogs, huge, powerful hounds, crash through the undergrowth. They are looking for the thrill of the chase. They are looking to corner a magnificent stag and feel the pride of the kill. They do not find one, but one of his foresters finds something else. A patch of disturbed earth. The faint smell of blood. They dig. They find the remains of the young buck. Sir Renaud is furious, not because he is hungry, but because his property has been stolen. A peasant has dared to take what belongs to the king and by extension to him. He orders the foresters to find the culprit. They search every hovel. They question every villager. Fear hangs over the settlement like a shroud. In Cynric's hut, a forester finds a single drop of dried blood on the floor near the hearth. It is enough. They drag him from his home. Edgith is crying, her fever still clinging to her. Cynric does not beg. He does not plead. He knows it is useless. He is an Englishman who has broken a Norman's law. He is taken to the manor court. Sir Renaud is the judge. There is no trial as we would know it. Cynric is guilty. The only question is the punishment. Sir Renaud wants to make an example of him. He declares that Cynric will be blinded. It is the common punishment for poachers. A man who cannot see, cannot aim an arrow. Cynric thought of the living deer in the forest, a creature of grace and wildness. Sir Renaud thought only of the venaison, a prize he had been denied. The two words describe the same animal, but they came from two different worlds. One was the world of a desperate father, the other was the world of a powerful lord. And in 12th century England, only one of those worlds had the power to make the laws. Number 9 mutton was the price of wool. And Thomas the shepherd stood on a windswept hill in the Cotswolds in the year 1349. Below him, a sea of gray woolly backs moved slowly across the green pasture. There were more than 500 of them. These were his scēap. It was the Old English word, the one his father and his father's father had used. The word was solid, earthy, like the animals themselves. Scēap were work. They were a constant, demanding presence. Thomas's life was ruled by the flock. He was born in a shepherd's hut, and he would likely die in one. His hands were calloused from the shepherd's crook and the shearing shears. He knew the flock better than he knew most people. He knew which ewe was a good mother, which ram was aggressive, which lamb was weak. He knew them not as a mass, but as individuals. His wealth, and more importantly the wealth of his master, was not in their meat. It was on their backs. The master was the Cistercian monastery in the valley. The monks were the greatest sheep farmers in all of England. They had thousands of acres and tens of thousands of scēap. The wool from their flocks was the finest in Europe. It was shipped from Bristol to merchants in Flanders and Italy. It was called the Golden Fleece of England. The entire kingdom's economy was built on the backs of these animals. For Thomas, a scēap was a four-legged machine for producing wool. Each year, in the early summer, was the shearing. It was back-breaking work. For weeks, he and the other shepherds would wrestle the heavy animals, clipping away the thick, greasy fleece. The monastery's agents would weigh it, grade it, and bale it. The money it fetched was immense. It paid for the monastery's great stone church, for its illuminated manuscripts, for the fine French wine the abbot drank. What was the animal's other purpose? Meat. But it was an afterthought. A healthy ewe would be bred for years until she was old and her teeth were worn down. A ram would be kept as long as it was strong. Only then, when its primary purpose was exhausted, would it be slaughtered. The meat from such an old animal was tough, fatty, and had a strong, gamey flavor. It was food for the farmhands and the shepherds. It was sustenance, not a delicacy. They would boil it for hours to make it tender, or salt it heavily to preserve it through the winter. It was simply the flesh of an old scēap. Miles away in London, a wealthy wool merchant named Jean de la Roche sat down to dinner. He was of Norman descent, though his family had been in the city for 2 centuries. He spoke French at home and in his business dealings. He had grown rich, acting as a middleman, buying wool from monasteries like the one that employed Thomas, and selling it to the weavers of Ghent. He was a man who understood profit, not pasture. On his table there was a roast. It was the centerpiece of the meal, surrounded by smaller dishes of game birds and spiced vegetables. The cook brought it in on a large platter. Jean de la Roche called it moton. The word came from the old French moton, which meant a ram, and by extension, a sheep. But for Jean, moton never meant the live animal. It meant the food on his plate. His moton was not from a tough old ewe. It was from a young wether, a castrated male, no more than 2 years old. It had been raised specifically for meat, fattened on the best grass. The meat was tender and pale. The cook had roasted it with rosemary and garlic, expensive herbs that came by ship from the continent. Jean carved it with a flourish. He served his guests, talking about the price of wool and the trouble with the king's taxes. He never thought of the animal's life. He never pictured a man like Thomas, standing in the rain, guarding the flock from wolves. He did not know the smell of a wet fleece or the sound of a newborn lamb. The scēap and the moton were 2 entirely separate concepts in his mind. The scēap was an entry in a ledger, a commodity that created his wealth. The moton was a luxury, a symbol of that wealth. Back in the Cotswolds, Thomas sat by his small fire, eating a stew. In it were a few pieces of tough meat from a 10-year-old ewe that had died the week before. It was chewy and strong tasting. As he ate, the Black Death was sweeping across England. It had arrived in Bristol on the same ships that carried the wool away. It would soon reach his village. It would kill the monks in the abbey and the merchant in London. It would kill Thomas himself. The plague did not distinguish between the man who said scēap and the man who said moton, but their lives and their language showed a world of difference. Number 8, the peasant's few chickens were her safety. The Lord's poultry was his feast. Ealf Gifu watched her small flock of chickens scratch in the dirt outside her wattle and daub hut. The year was 1210. The village was a small collection of houses clustered around a simple wooden church, all of it belonging to the local lord, Sir Guy de Montfort. Ealf Gifu was a widow. Her husband had died of a fever the previous winter, leaving her with 2 small children and a tiny plot of land. Her chickens were her lifeline. She called them cicen, the old English word. It was a word that sounded like the pecking and clucking of the birds themselves. Her flock was small, no more than 10 hens and a single proud cockerel. They were scrawny, tough birds, a mix of breeds that scavenged for whatever they could find. They ate insects, spilled grain, and scraps from Ealf Gifu's meager meals. These cicens were not primarily for meat. Their value was in their eggs. Each morning, Ealf Gifu would carefully collect the few small, pale brown eggs. Most of them she did not eat. 2 eggs per week were part of her rent to Sir Guy. This was the egg rent, a common obligation for the poorer villagers. The rest she could trade. An egg could be bartered for a handful of salt from a traveling peddler. 2 eggs could get her a small measure of flour from the miller, after the lord had taken his share, of course. The chickens themselves were a form of currency. On feast days, she was required to give the lord a present of a hen. This was not a gift, it was a tax. When one of her hens grew old and stopped laying, then, and only then, would she consider it for her own family's pot. The meat was stringy and needed to be boiled for hours with herbs from her garden to make it palatable. It was a rare treat, a moment of luxury in a life of endless toil. The cockerel was the most valuable of all. He was the future of her flock. To kill him would be to eat her own security. In the stone manor house on the hill, Sir Guy's cook, a man from Normandy named Jean-Paul, was preparing for a feast. Sir Guy was entertaining a neighboring lord. The kitchen was a flurry of activity. Jean-Paul did not think in terms of cicens. When he thought in terms of pouletrie, the word came from the old French poulet, a young chicken. Pouletrie was not just the bird itself, but the entire category of domestic fowl prepared for the table. The manor had its own poultry yard, much larger and better organized than Eyjolfgifu's scattered flock. Hundreds of birds were raised there. They were fed on grain, not just scraps. They were fattened for slaughter. And Jean-Paul had his pick of the best. He was not making a simple boiled fowl. He was preparing a dozen different dishes of pouletrie. There were young chickens, poulets, roasted on a spit, their skin glistening with butter. There were capons, castrated cockerels that grew fat and tender, their flesh considered a great delicacy. He was making a blancmange, a popular dish where chicken meat was shredded, boiled with rice flour and almond milk into a thick white paste, and sweetened with sugar. It was food designed to show off wealth. Sugar, almonds, and rice were all imported and fantastically expensive. For another dish, he was making helmeted cocks. The birds were boiled, then skinned. The meat was ground with spices and lard, stuffed back inside the skin, and sewn up. The bird was then positioned on the platter as if it were alive, sometimes with a small paper helmet and a tiny lance fixed to its wing. It was food as entertainment, a spectacle. When a servant brought in the basket of rent eggs and hens from the village, Jean-Paul barely glanced at them. He would use the eggs in custards and sauces. The hens from the villagers, like Eyjolfgifu's, were old and tough. He would not roast these. They were destined for the stock pot to be boiled for hours to create a flavorful broth, a bouillon, that would be the base for his elegant sauces. The essence of Eyjolfgifu's hen would grace Sergei's plate, but its tough flesh would be given to the servants or the dogs. Eyjolfgifu stood at her door, calling her cicens in for the night, protecting them from foxes. She counted them. Each one was a small treasure, a defense against utter starvation. Sergei sat at his table, laughing with his guest, wiping grease from his lips. He pointed at a platter and asked for another piece of pouletrie. For her, the bird was a living asset. For him, it was an ingredient, a canvas for his cook's art. The difference was not just in the words. It was in the hunger, the security, and the power that separated the hut from the manor house. Number 7, to lose a calf was to lose the future. To eat veal was a mark of status. Godwin leaned on his hoe and looked at the calf. The year was 1086. The Doomsday Book, the great survey of the new Norman kingdom, had just been completed. Godwin was listed in it, not by name, but as one of the Villani, the villains, belonging to the estate of a Norman knight named Odo. Of Godwin was, in effect, property, just like the land he worked. The calf was 2 months old. It was a wobbly, curious creature, sticking close to its mother, a dun-colored cow named Daisy. The cow was the family's most important possession. She pulled the plow alongside Godwin's own ox. She gave a small amount of milk, enough for his children. She produced manure, which was vital for the thin soil of their strip of land in the common field. The cow was the engine of their survival. The calf was the future. Godwin called it a scēap, the Old English word. And if it was a female, she would one day replace her mother. If it was a male, he could be trained as an ox for plowing, or if they were lucky, sold at market for a few precious silver pennies. To raise the scēap to adulthood was the family's primary goal for the next 2 years. It represented hope. It was an investment of time, meager fodder, and constant worry, but the calf was not truly Godwin's. Like the land, and like Godwin himself, it belonged to Odo. And Odo's wife was hosting a dinner for a visiting bishop. The reeve, the manager of the estate, came to Godwin's small holding. He was an Englishman, but he served the Norman lord. He pointed at the scēap. "The Lord needs it," he said, without ceremony. Godwin's heart sank. He could not refuse. It was his lord's right to demand it as a tax, a tithe. It was part of the rent for the land he was bound to. He argued, but not with any hope. He pleaded that the animal was too young, that its mother would be distressed. The reeve was unmoved. "The Lord's cook wants a young one." Godwin's wife wept as they led the calf away. It was not just the loss of the animal, it was the loss of the future it represented. They had been thrown back, their small progress erased. They would have to hope the cow would bear another calf next year and pray that the Lord would not take that one too. In the manor kitchen, the cook saw the animal arrive. He was a Norman, and he did not call it a calf. He called it veal. The word came from the old French veal, which itself came from the Latin vitellices, meaning a little calf. For the cook, we spent a lot was a specific ingredient. It meant the meat of a very young calf, prized for its pale color and extreme tenderness. In his view, Godwin had been doing a poor job. The scēap had been drinking its mother's milk and eating grass. This would make the meat reddish and tougher. True veal, The kind served in the great houses in Normandy came from a calf that had been kept in a dark pen, fed only on milk, its movement restricted to keep the muscles from developing. This produced a meat that was almost white, with a delicate texture. But this would have to do. He slaughtered the animal. He had no sentiment about it. It was a task, like chopping onions. He carefully prepared the best cuts, the loin, the leg. He would roast these with expensive spices bought from a merchant in the nearest town, pepper and cloves, shipped from the other side of the world. The less tender parts, the shoulder and the neck, would be used in a stew, a ragout, flavored with wine and herbs from the manor garden. And that evening, the bishop and Odo sat at the high table. A servant brought in the roasted veal. The bishop, a sophisticated man who had spent time in Rome, complimented Odo on the quality of the meat. "A fine veal," he said. "It is a sign of a well-managed estate." Odo beamed with pride. He saw the veal on his table as a reflection of his own status. It showed that he was a powerful lord, able to command the best of everything his land produced. He could afford to slaughter an animal in its infancy to consume the future for a moment of present pleasure. He did not think of the farmer who had raised it. He did not know Godwin's name. Down in the village, Godwin and his family ate a thin pottage of barley and beans. The cow lowed mournfully in the byre, missing her calf. Godwin looked at his children. The future seemed a little bit further away tonight. The lord ate veal, the meat of a young animal, a luxury. Godwin was left with the coo, the old cow, the animal of labor. The two words represented the two ends of a chain of power, one of consumption and one of loss. Number 6, a swine in the forest was a peasant's wealth. Pork on the table was a lord's right. The man's name is Gurth, and he is a swineherd. The year is 1321. He lives in a small hut on the edge of a great oak forest that belongs to the Earl of Warwick. Gurth's entire existence is tied to the herd of pigs in his charge. They are not his pigs. They belong to the Earl and to the various free tenants of the manor who have the right of pennage, the right to graze their swine in the Lord's forest. Gurth's word for the animals is swīn. It is a good, solid Old English word. It sounds like the animal itself, guttural, of the earth. In the autumn, his job is to drive the herd deep into the forest to feed on the fallen acorns. This is the most important time of the year. The acorns fatten the swīn, giving their meat a rich, nutty flavor. A pig that has fed on acorns is worth twice as much as one fed on scraps. Gurth knows these animals. He knows their grunts and squeals. He knows the fierce old sow who leads the herd and the runt who always gets pushed away from the best foraging spots. He lives a life almost as wild as theirs. He sleeps in a temporary shelter of branches. He eats what he can carry, hard bread, a little cheese, and water from the stream. He smells of wood smoke and pig. The swīn are a walking larder, a source of wealth for the whole community. A peasant family might own only one or two, their investment for the year. After the autumn fattening, most would be slaughtered. The event around the Feast of Martimas in November was a crucial part of the village calendar. It was a time of communal labor. The men would do the killing and butchering, the women would salt the meat, render the fat into lard, and make sausages from the intestines and blood. Every part of the swīn was used. The meat would be salted and smoked, hung from the rafters of their small homes to provide food through the long, lean winter. The lard was for cooking and for making candles. The skin could be turned into leather. Even the bristles were used to make brushes. For a peasant, the swīn was the key to surviving until the next harvest. It was their insurance against starvation. In the great hall of Warwick Castle, the Earl is planning his Christmas feast. He is one of the most powerful men in England, and his feast will be a display of that power. He sits with his steward, dictating the menu. He wants a spectacle. At the center of it all, he wants a great dish of pork. The word is Norman French, from the Latin porcuses, for the Earl porcuses has no connection to the muddy, grunting animal in the forest. Pork is a food. It is the end product. He does not think of Gurth the swineherd. He thinks of the taste, the presentation. The castle cook receives his orders. He needs dozens of pigs. The Earl's reeve rides out to the villages and collects the lord's share. The peasants must give up their best animals as part of their feudal duty. A family that had hoped to have a whole pig for the winter might now have only half a one. There is no negotiation. The castle kitchens become a factory for processing pork. The cooks do not use every part out of necessity, but out of artistry. They roast whole suckling pigs. They make brawn, a jelly loaf made from the pig's head. They make rich pies filled with seasoned porks and fruit. They create subtleties, elaborate sculptures made from cooked meat and pastry designed to delight and surprise the guests. One popular dish is the cicen, a bizarre creation where the front half of a piglet is sewn to the back half of a large chicken or capon. The whole thing is then roasted and served as if it were a single, mythical beast. This is not food for survival. This is food as theater, as a demonstration of a household so wealthy it can afford to be playful and wasteful with its resources. At the feast, the Earl and his guests gorge themselves on pork. They eat the most tender cuts, the loin and the leg. The rest is given to the servants and the soldiers in the garrison. Gurth the swineherd, his job done for the season, is back in his village. For his work, he is paid not in coin, but in kind. He is given the offal of one of the pigs, the heart, the liver, the lungs. It is known as the swineherd's perk. He takes it home to his family. They will make a stew from it. As he eats, he can see the lights of the great castle on the hill. He knows they are feasting up there. They are eating the meat of the swin he raised, but they call it pork. The name changes somewhere on the road between the forest and the castle. It changes from a word of work to a word of luxury. Gurth knows the animal. The Earl knows the dish. And between them lies the whole structure of their world. Number 5, the cow pulled the plow, the beef graced the table. The year is 1290. Edwig is a farmer, a bondsman tied to a manor in the English Midlands. His most prized possession is a pair of oxen. They are slow, patient, immensely strong beasts. Edwig spends most of his waking hours with them. In the spring, he walks behind them from sunrise to sunset, guiding the heavy wooden plow through the Lord's fields, then his own small strip of land. He calls the animals coo, or more often oxan. It's the Old English word. For Edwig, a coo is not primarily a source of meat or milk. It is a source of power. It is a living tractor. Without his oxen, he cannot cultivate the land. Without the land, his family will starve. The beasts are his partners in a life of relentless labor. He knows every groan and twitch of their muscles. He knows how to soothe them with a soft word, how to urge them on with a sharp command. His 2 oxen are old. The one on the left, named Horn, is nearly 12. His steps are getting slower. His strength is beginning to fail. Edwig knows that soon Horn will no longer be able to pull his weight. When that day comes, the animal's working life will be over. In the manor house, the Lord, Sir Roger de Bracy, a knight who fought with King Edward in Wales, is planning a feast for his daughter's wedding. He wants to show his wealth and generosity to the guests. He tells his steward to arrange for a supply of good meat. And Sir Roger does not speak of Q, he speaks of both. It is the Norman French word derived from the Latin bosses. For Sir Roger, both is the flesh of a bovine animal, a staple food, but one that comes in varying qualities. He would never dream of eating one of his own prized destriers, his war horses, but both is for consumption. The steward informs Sir Roger that a young bullock from the Lord's own herd, one that has been grazing on good pasture for 3 years, will be slaughtered for the high table. It will be roasted whole over a great fire. This is high quality, both tender and flavorful, fit for the noble guests. But a wedding feast is a massive undertaking. The whole village will be given food as a sign of the Lord's largesse. Dozens, even hundreds of people need to be fed. The steward cannot afford to slaughter the entire manor herd. So he looks for other sources of meat. He tells the reeve to survey the peasants' animals. The reeve comes to Edwig's plot. He inspects Horn. He sees the animal's age, its failing strength. He informs Edwig that Horn is to be taken for the feast. It is not a request. Edwig receives a pittance in compensation, a few pennies, far less than the animal's worth as a worker. It is a devastating blow. He will now struggle to plow his land with just 1 ox. Horn is led to the manor. The animal is slaughtered, but its meat is not destined for the high table. The cook knows that the flesh of an old working animal like Horn will be incredibly tough. It is full of hard muscle and gristle. Roasting it would be pointless. It would be like chewing leather. So the carcass of Horn, the old coo, is butchered for the common folk. The meat is chopped into small pieces and thrown into huge cauldrons. It is boiled for hours and hours with barley and root vegetables to make a thick pottage, or a browet. The long, slow cooking breaks down the tough fibers and makes the meat edible. Some of it is minced, mixed with suet and spices, the cheaper ones like pepper, and baked into pies with thick pastry crusts. These are meat pies or chouettes. The pastry is not always meant to be eaten. Sometimes it is just a container, a way of cooking and serving the tough meat inside. At the wedding feast, Sir Roger and his family sit at the high table on a raised platform eating tender roasted boeuf from the young bullock. They use knives to cut the meat and eat with their fingers. They drink French wine from silver goblets. Down below, in the main body of the hall, Edwig and the other villagers sit on benches. They are served the pies and the pottage made from their own old animals. They eat from wooden bowls with wooden spoons. They drink weak ale. Edwig might be eating a piece of his own ox, Horn. He is eating his lost livelihood. For Edwig, the Q was a partner, a source of power, a living being whose end was a tragedy for his family. For Sir Roger, boeuf was a meal, a sign of his status, a commodity to be consumed. The animal was the same. But the words and the worlds they represented were utterly different. One was the world of labor and loss. The other was the world of feasting and power. Number 4, a goat was the poor man's cow. Its meat was a last resort. The year is 1150, during the reign of King Stephen, a time of civil war and chaos often called the Anarchy. In a small village in the Rocky Hills of the Peak District, a woman named Agnes lives with her elderly mother. They are among the poorest of the poor. They are cotters, meaning they hold a tiny cottage and a garden, but have no land in the common fields. They survive by doing day labor for the other villagers and for, the manor when work is available. Their most valuable possession is a goat. Her name is Nan. Agnes calls her a got, the Old English word. Nan is a scrawny, intelligent, and cantankerous animal. She is perfectly suited to their life. Unlike a cow, she needs no rich pasture. She can survive on the scrubby, marginal land at the edge of the village, eating weeds, brambles, and ivy that other animals would ignore. She is, in the truest sense, the poor man's cow. Every morning and evening, Agnes milks Nan. The goat doesn't give much milk, perhaps a quart a day, but it is rich and creamy. This milk is the foundation of their diet. They drink some of it, but most of it, Agnes carefully turns into cheese. The small, hard goat cheeses are their main source of protein. They can also be used for barter. A cheese might get them a loaf of bread or a small bag of oats. The goat is also a source of future hope. Each year, Nan has a kid. If it is a female, Agnes can raise it to increase her small herd. If it is a male, a buck kid, he is usually slaughtered and eaten when he is a few weeks old. The meat is a rare luxury, a feast for 2 people. But Agnes would never, ever consider slaughtering Nan. The goat is far too valuable alive. She is a producer of milk, cheese, and offspring. She is the engine of their tiny, fragile economy. Miles away, in a fortified manor, lives a Norman lord who is a minor player in the ongoing war. He has recently switched his allegiance to the Empress Matilda. To celebrate this new alliance, he is hosting a dinner for some of her knights. He wants to offer them something a little unusual, a little sophisticated. He speaks with his cook about the menu. The lord mentions that he once had a fine dish made from a young goat while on a campaign in Anjou, in France. The cook knows the dish. In French, the meat of a goat is called chivre, from the Latin capra. The meat of a young goat, a kid, is called chivro. The Lord Steward is tasked with procuring a goat. The manor does not keep them. They are considered lowly animals, not fit for a noble's estate. So the reeve is sent to the village. He knows who has a goat. He goes to Agnes's cottage. He offers to buy Nan. Agnes refuses, terrified. She explains that the goat is all she has. The reeve, under pressure from the steward, does not care. He offers a few coins. When Agnes still refuses, he simply seizes the animal in the Lord's name. This is a time of lawlessness. A poor cotter has no rights against a lord's man. Agnes is left with nothing. In the manor kitchen, the cook inspects the goat. He is disappointed. Nan is an old goat, thin and tough. This is not the young, tender chevreau he was hoping for. The meat will be strong tasting and stringy. He complains to the steward, who tells him to make the best of it. The cook slaughters none. He cannot roast the meat. It would be inedible. Instead, he must use all his skill to disguise its toughness and strong flavor. He marinates the meat overnight in red wine and vinegar with pungent herbs like thyme and bay leaves. Then he cuts it into small pieces and stews it for many hours in a heavy pot with onions, garlic, and a few precious peppercorns. The long, slow cooking in an acidic liquid helps to break down the tough muscle. The strong seasonings help to mask the gamey flavor of the old goat. At the dinner, the dish is served. The lord announces it as chever en ragut. The knights, who are rough soldiers, eat it heartily. They are hungry and not particularly fussy. They compliment the lord on his hospitality. The lord accepts the praise, feeling he has provided his guests with an authentic taste of France. He never knows or cares that he has just destroyed the livelihood of one of his poorest tenants. In her dark cottage, Agnes and her mother eat a supper of boiled weeds. The silence where Nan's bleating should be is deafening. For Agnes, the gut was life. It was milk, cheese, and a future. For the lord, chevré was a passing fancy, an attempt to impress his guests, a dish to be consumed and forgotten. The two words point to the same animal, but they occupy opposite ends of the spectrum of human desperation and casual power. Number 3, a dove in the air, was free a squab on the plate, was property. The year is 1415, just before King Henry V sets out for his campaign in France that will end at Agincourt. In a village in southern England, a boy named Robin is an expert climber. His special skill is climbing the manor's dovecote. The dovecote is a large circular stone tower with a rotating ladder inside. The inner walls are a honeycomb of over 1,000 nesting boxes or pigeonholes. It is home to a massive flock of rock doves or pigeons. Robin's word for them is dufay from the Old English. The dovecote is a living pantry and it belongs exclusively to the lord of the manor. No peasant was allowed to build one. The birds were a source of fresh meat all year round, especially in the winter when other livestock had been slaughtered and salted down. The pigeons foraged for themselves, often feeding on the peasants' newly sown grain fields, much to their frustration. The peasants were forbidden from scaring them away or harming them in any way. The birds ate the peasants' crops, but the peasants were not allowed to eat the birds. The robin's job is to harvest the young. Twice a month he climbs the rickety internal ladder, moving it around the walls to reach the nests. He is looking for the young pigeons that are almost fully grown but have not yet flown. These fledglings are called squabs. They are fat, tender, and helpless. Robin's hands are quick. He reaches into the nest, grabs the young bird, and quickly and cleanly breaks its neck. He drops the small, warm body into a sack tied at his waist. He works for hours, the air in the dovecote thick with the smell of droppings and the sound of cooing from the adult birds. The pigeon droppings, called guano, are almost as valuable as the birds themselves. Robin also has to scrape the thick layers of droppings from the floor and ledges. It is a powerful fertilizer rich in nitrogen and used on the Lord's gardens and vineyards. For Robin, the dufay are just birds. The work is dirty and unpleasant, but it earns him a few extra pennies in the cook's favor. He sees the young birds as a crop, like reaping wheat. In the manor house kitchen, the cook takes the sack of young pigeons from Robin. The cook is a literate man, and he keeps records of the household's expenses. He does not write down 50 young dufay. He writes down scēap, the Norman French word for squab. The word had come to England with the Normans and was part of the language of aristocratic cuisine. Scēap were a delicacy. Because they had never flown, their muscles were undeveloped, and their meat was incredibly tender and pale. They were a sign of luxury, of a household that could afford a constant supply of fresh meat. The cook prepares the squabs in several ways for the Lord's dinner. 4 of them are simply roasted on small spits, basted with butter and seasoned with salt. They are served whole, 2 to a plate. Another dozen are baked into a pie. The cook bones the bird, seasons the meat with mace and ginger, and lays it in a pastry case, or coffin, with dried fruits like raisins and dates. This was a scēap pie, a rich and sweet dish popular with the nobility. The remaining birds are used for a sublety, a decorative dish. They are boiled, the meat is removed from the bones and ground into a paste with breadcrumbs and egg yolks. The paste is then molded back into the shape of a bird, re-feathered with the original feathers, and placed on the table as if it were still alive. The lord of the manor, Sir John, dines that night with his wife and a visiting knight. They eat the roasted scēap with their fingers, picking the small bones clean. Sir John complains about the cost of equipping his men at arms for the upcoming war in France. He talks of the glory to be won. He does not think about the boy who climbed the tower, or the fact that the birds on his plate had been fattened on the grain of his own tenants. To him, the scēap were a product of his dovecote, a physical manifestation of his legal rights and his social standing. To Robin, the dūfē were just birds he had to kill. To the peasant farmer whose field they fed on, they were a pest he was not allowed to touch. The bird itself was the same, but the name it was given and the right to eat it depended entirely on where you stood in the rigid hierarchy of medieval England. Number 2, a hen was a tax, a pullet was a treat. The year is 1381. A time of great unrest that will soon erupt into the peasants' revolt. In a village in Essex, a woman named Wat's wife women were often identified by their husband's name, looks over her small flock of chickens. She has a few older hens, good for laying eggs, which are a vital part of her family's diet and her rent. But she also has several younger birds hatched in the spring. These are young female chickens, not yet a year old. In her English dialect, she might call them young hen. They have just started to lay their first small eggs. They are at a crucial point in their lives. If she keeps them, they will become reliable egg layers for the next few years. If she slaughters one, it will provide a tender meal, far better than an old, tough boiler. But to kill one is to sacrifice future eggs. It is a constant calculation for a peasant family living on the edge. The decision is often made for her. Her husband, Wat, is a villain. He holds his land from the local Benedictine priory. In addition to working on the priory's own lands, the demise, for several days a week, he owes a variety of rents and dues. One of these is a food rent at Christmas. He is required to provide the priory with 1 good cock and 2 hens. The priory's reeve comes to collect. He is a shrewd man. He will not accept any old, scraggy birds. He inspects Wat's flock. He points to 2 of the finest young hens, the ones that promise years of egg laying. Wat's wife argues, but it is no use. The hens are the priory's right. They are a tax paid in feathers and flesh. She is left with the older birds. Her family's security for the coming year is diminished. The 2 young hens are taken to the priory kitchens. The head cook is a monk, Brother Thomas, who is in charge of the monastery's diet. He is an educated man. He reads and writes in Latin and French. When he records the delivery in his account book, he does not write hen. He writes poultices. The Latin, or more likely, uses the French-derived term that was common in large households, poulet. A young hen was specifically a poulet. For Brother Thomas, a poulet is a specific culinary item. It is different from an old hengalina, which would be used for soup stock. It is different from a capon, which was richer and fatter. A poulet was prized for its lean, tender meat. It was considered a light and restorative food suitable for important guests or for monks who were infirm. The priory is expecting a visit from a representative of the bishop. A special meal must be prepared. Brother Thomas decides the 2 pullets from Wat's farm will be perfect. He does not roast them. That would be too plain. Instead, he decides to make poulets and galantine. This is a refined and complex dish. The poulets are poached gently in a broth of wine and water. Then the meat is removed from the bones. The broth is strained and mixed with toasted breadcrumbs, which thicken it into a sauce. The sauce is seasoned with expensive spices, ginger, galangal, and cloves. Crucially, it is made sharp with vinegar. The dark, glossy, and powerfully flavored galantine sauce is then poured over the slices of pullet meat. The bishop's man dines with the prior. He is served the pullet dish. He eats it with a spoon and a piece of bread to sop up the sauce. He compliments the prior on the quality of his kitchen. The meal is a quiet statement of the priory's wealth and sophistication. The spices, the wine, the tender meat all are signs of a well-run, prosperous house of God. The prior accepts the compliment. He may or may not know that the pullets were part of a tenant's rent. He would not know the anger and frustration of Wat's wife. He would not connect the elegant dish on the table with the growing resentment among the peasantry about the burden of rents and tithes. For Wat's wife, the young Henne was future food, a living piece of property that had been taken from her. It was a tangible loss that made her family's life harder. For Brother Thomas, the poulet was an ingredient, the basis for a dish that demonstrated his culinary skill and his monastery's prestige. The name changed at the Priory Gate, and with it the meaning changed from one of peasant economy to one of aristocratic consumption. A few months later, men like her husband Wat would march on London, burning manor houses and demanding an end to the very system that turned their hen into a lord's poulet. Number 1. Any man could catch a fish, but only a lord could take a salmon. The year is 1452. The Wars of the Roses are brewing, and the great lords of the realm are gathering their power. On the banks of the River Severn in Gloucestershire, a man named John is checking his fish trap. He is a poor fisherman living in a small hut near the river. The river is his life. John thinks of the creatures in the river simply as fisk, the Old English word. It covers everything: the small eels he traps in his wicker basket, the bream, the perch, the pike. Fiscus is food. It is what saves his family from hunger when the grain runs out. It is what he can salt and smoke to last through the winter. On Fridays and during the long weeks of Lent, when the church forbids the eating of meat, the whole country turns to fisk. For the poor, this means cheap, common fish like herring, often heavily salted and packed in barrels. John is not allowed to fish wherever he pleases. The river itself belongs to the local lord, the Earl of Shrewsbury. John has the right to fish in a certain stretch using only simple traps and lines, but some parts of the river, the best pools are the lord's private fishery. And some fish are considered the lord's private property, no matter where they are caught. One morning, John finds something extraordinary in his trap. It is a huge silverfish, longer than his arm, with a powerful muscular body. It is a salmon, a king among fish. John's heart leaps. A fish this size could feed his family for a week, or he could sell it in the town market for a sum of money that would be a fortune to him. But he knows he cannot. By law and custom, any salmon caught in the river belongs to the lord of the manor. It is a royal fish, like the sturgeon or the whale. To be caught with it would be theft. It would mean a flogging or being put in the stocks in the village square. He stands there for a long time, looking at the magnificent fisk. It is the greatest catch of his life. With a heavy heart, he carefully takes the salmon from the trap. He knows what he must do. He carries it, dripping, up the path to the great castle that dominates the landscape. He delivers the fish to the castle kitchens. The steward of the household, a stern man dressed in fine wool, takes the fish without a word of thanks. He gives John a single silver penny for his trouble. It is a pittance, a fraction of the fish's true worth. The steward takes the fish to the master cook. The cook is a man of great importance in the household. He sees the fish and his eyes light up. He does not call it fisk, he calls it salmon, the Norman French word. The name itself, derived from the Latin salmo, has an air of elegance and importance. For the cook, salmon is a prestige ingredient. It is a dish to be served at the high table for the Earl and his family. Its rarity and its legal status as the Lord's property make it a symbol of power. Serving salmon is a way of displaying the Earl's control over the lands and rivers of his domain. The cook decides to prepare the salmon in a grand style. He will bake it whole. First, he poaches the fish lightly in a court bouillon of white wine, water, and herbs. Then he carefully removes the skin. He covers the fish in a rich paste of butter and flour and bakes it until golden. He creates an elaborate sauce to go with it, a green sauce made from sorrel, parsley, and other herbs from the castle garden, ground in a mortar with breadcrumbs and vinegar. That evening, the great salmon is carried into the hall on a silver platter. The Earl carves it himself. He and his family eat the delicate pink flesh. They talk of politics, of the conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster. The Earl is a Lancastrian, a supporter of King Henry VI. He needs to maintain his power, his authority. The salmon on his table is a small part of that performance. It says, "This river is mine. Its greatest treasures are for my table alone. And John, back in his hut, eats a small, bony bream that he caught later that day. He roasts it over his fire. It is his fisk. It is his sustenance. As he eats, he thinks of the great silver fish that passed through his hands. He, the fisherman, caught it, but he could not eat it. The law, the Lord, and the language itself had claimed it. In the river, it was just a fish. But the moment it was caught, it became a salmon, a piece of property, a symbol of the great unbridgeable gap between the man who worked the river and the man who owned it.